to say that this story of Zacchaeus, the short guy who climbs up a tree to see Jesus pass through his hometown, only to be noticed by Jesus and called out of the tree to have Jesus for dinner, this is a story that always gives me kind of a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's surely a beloved Bible story, one that we particularly like to tell to kids who can identify with what it's like to be too short to see things, and who like to be affirmed that Jesus reaches out to them. There are, of course, some cute children's songs like the one in the prelude, Zacchaeus was a wee little man. And I have happy memories of teaching this in vacation Bible school, making trees, going out climbing everything we could find to climb. But someone pointed out to me this week that the story of Zacchaeus is really an adult story more than a children's story. It's a story about sin and corruption, conversion and repentance. Now, perhaps the thing that has us rooting for Zacchaeus from the very beginning is how strongly he was seeking to see Jesus. Clearly, Zacchaeus had a very strong desire to see Jesus, so strong that he was willing to overcome his risk of ridicule and embarrassment and to climb a tree. Zacchaeus stands in for all of us who are seeking, all of us who have a sense that our life isn't everything we want it to be, all of us who are driven into the door of a church because of a sense of yearning for something deeper, for something more real, for something more. And notice that in Luke's gospel, it's quite clear that Zacchaeus is rich. He can have anything that money can buy, but it's not enough, and it doesn't fulfill him. Maybe Zacchaeus is a candidate to read that old book, When Everything You Ever Wanted Isn't Enough. Despite being rich and powerful and successful, Zacchaeus is still searching, still yearning for something more. He has heard about Jesus, and he wonders if Jesus can help him with this deeper question. And so, in his desperation, he climbs a tree to see Jesus come by. Now, we may be rooting for Zacchaeus, the tree climber, but his neighbors and community were not. In fact, the evidence is that he was despised by his community. They certainly wouldn't get out of the way so he could see Jesus. They certainly wouldn't let him into the front row of the parade route. No, Zacchaeus was a tax collector. And not just any tax collector, but he was the chief tax collector for the region. And Luke's gospel has shown us again and again that tax collectors are outcast, despised, and hated. As I said last week, a lot of this has to do with how tax collection happened in those days. The occupying Roman Empire would contract out tax collecting to the locals. They would assign each person a region and a fee. The tax collector then had to collect that money in any way possible to pay off the Roman fee. And anything more that they collected was their pay. It was a corrupt system that motivated people to shake down their neighbors for everything they could get, to oppress people who were already in trouble, to take away land and what little bit that poor people had in order to pay the tax. Tax collectors were not only ceremonially unclean, but they were politically treasonous. They were collaborators. And in a corrupt system, the loftier one's position, the greater one's complicity with that system. So why be a tax collector? What would lead someone to that profession? I can only guess it was the money. There was good money to be made, and I would guess that that led to this kind of ultimate temptation, that the more you cheated people, the more you oppressed people, the richer you would get. Instead of loving your neighbor, you were shaking them down, for your own benefit. So we can see that Zacchaeus' relationship with money had warped his relationships with other people, with his community. His financial reality is profoundly connected with his social and spiritual reality, leaving him outcast, unfulfilled, and lost. Perhaps the most difficult reality is that we who live and participate in and benefit from an unjust and hurtful system, the way Zacchaeus did, cannot claim that our personal religion isolates us from our complicity in such a system. What is the impact of the way we do our economics on our community and on our world? Billy Graham once said, "If a person gets his attitude toward money straight, it will straighten out almost every other area of his life." So along comes Jesus. And instead of seeing Zacchaeus as a hopeless case, Jesus sees him as a child of God. Instead of seeing Zacchaeus as worthy of communal exclusion, Jesus invites himself over to Zacchaeus' house for dinner. We've seen that before, haven't we? Jesus reaching out to the lost, the despised, the rejected. Jesus choosing to hang out with the scandalous. Jesus raising the eyebrows of those around and murmurings by the company that he chooses to keep. Zacchaeus' mistakes have not moved him out beyond the reach of God's seeking love. His corruption has not made him unforgivable or beyond potential. Nothing is impossible with God, and nothing can separate us from God's love. Grace abounds for Zacchaeus and for those who would seem too far gone to be saved. And that's good news, isn't it? Jesus doesn't just reach out to the brightest and the best, to the saints. He reaches out to those who struggle with sin. Zacchaeus doesn't have to earn Jesus' love and attention. It is a free gift. So when Jesus sees Zacchaeus up in the tree, he calls out to him, and he chooses Zacchaeus to be his host in Jericho. He invites himself over for dinner. And this is a big deal, an honor and an opportunity. We hear that Zacchaeus rushed down the tree and was happy to welcome Jesus. There's a sense of joy in this moment. And we hear that this encounter with Christ changes Zacchaeus. We hear that there is a conversion that has some practical consequences for Zacchaeus' finances and for his community. Scripture tells us that Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." In the Old Testament, voluntary restitution involved the original amount plus 20%, according to Leviticus and Numbers. Compulsory restitution called for doubling the original, and in some cases even paying 4 or 5-fold. But Zacchaeus hadn't been caught and convicted or forced. He wasn't being forced to repay those he had defrauded. His response to Jesus is from the heart. And with that, he goes beyond the law's requirement to the requirement of his faith and his heart. Reformer Martin Luther suggested that there are 3 conversions that need to happen in the Christian life: a conversion of the heart, a conversion of the mind, and a conversion of the wallet. Conversion is not just a private thing in our hearts, but it has communal implications. Conversion calls us to move to justice and to move to generosity. Coming close to Jesus affects not only ourselves, but through us, our entire community. Encountering the radical grace and the power of Jesus' good news leads Zacchaeus to offer half his possessions to the poor and a generous restitution to anyone he may have cheated. For Zacchaeus, this dramatic encounter with Christ led him to rethink his money life. It led him to bring it into alignment with his faith. Money stopped being the organizing principle of Zacchaeus' life. Now, it was the love of Christ that ordered his whole life. We're a little late getting into stewardship season this year because of my medical leave, but we're launching in slowly. And I have to say that through the years, for me, my understanding about stewardship and generosity has really shifted. I grew up in a church where it was really all about what the church needed. That if we could only collect a little more money, the church could do more ministry together. Great thing. But over time, I've come to understand even if the church needed not one thing, not one penny to thrive, I would still need to give. Because this act of stewardship, of really kind of taking inventory of the abundance that God has poured into my life and paying attention to whether or not how I'm using those gifts reflects my faith, is a really important act. As Billy Graham said, getting our financial life straight gets other parts of our life straight as well. And so for me, stewardship is only partly about supporting what the church needs. It's also a spiritual practice that helps me grow and to bring my material life in alignment with my financial life. I think that's part of the invitation of the story of Zacchaeus. But I have to take a moment and say that whenever I read the story about Zacchaeus, I also can't help but pause and think about the crowd. The ones who wouldn't get out of the way so that Zacchaeus could see Jesus, could have this kind of transformational experience. It's not that I blame them. After all, they'd probably been shaken down by Zacchaeus. They'd experienced the injustice of it all, while Zacchaeus seemed to be over there thriving on the corruption of his day. He was wealthy, and they were probably struggling. They had their reasons for being angry, and they had their own reasons for yearning to encounter Jesus. Why should they put Zacchaeus ahead of their own needs? Had they given up on him? Had they decided that Zacchaeus was a disposable person? Had they judged him and found him beyond redemption? It's easy, I think, to put people into boxes. We hear it all the time these days in the media. To think of people as being outside our concern, not worth the effort. They made their bed, they have to lie in it, sort of folks. But people are messy and complex. They're not all good or all bad. I've been really inspired by the words of Sister Helen Prejean, who has been a nun who works with death row inmates and talks about that. And when she talks about that, she talks about why she offers them ministry. And she says, people are more than the worst thing they did in their lives. The crowd ostracized Zacchaeus and shut him out. But Jesus saw more. Instead of seeing Zacchaeus as a corrupt tax collector, Jesus saw that it was possible, what was possible for him and what God wanted for him. And with that love and grace, things changed, not just for Zacchaeus, but for the community and for those who had been impacted by his corruption. I wonder who the Zacchaeus people are today. Who do we judge and reject and think is beyond the range of our concern, of our ministry? Who are those who would scandalize us if we came in contact? Who is hungering for the love of God? Because the truth is that God's grace is outrageous. We like to say, no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. But do we really mean it? Because guess who Jesus invited to supper?